I'm Izzy Conn, and welcome back to Leading Labour, and this episode on Ed Miliband. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each of the former Labour leaders. We look at how each leader responded to major political developments, managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and, overall, how they sought to win elections and bring Labour into government. Miliband took over from Gordon Brown in 2010 and was Labour leader for 5 years until 2015. And he's obviously still prominent in the Labour Party today as Secretary of State for Energy, Security and Net Zero. Miliband was born in 1969, and he and his older brother David Miliband grew up in a very political household in London. Their parents were both Jewish refugees. Their father, Ralph Miliband, was born to Polish Jewish parents, but raised in Belgium. He fled the Nazis with his father in 1940, settling in Britain. Their mother, Marian Kozak, also Polish Jewish, survived the war thanks to people who hid her family from the Nazis. She moved to the UK after the war. Ed Miliband reflected in 2018 that the wartime experience gave his parents a sense of the preciousness of life and the importance of leaving the world a better place. Ralph Miliband, who died in 1994, had a really interesting life. He studied at the LSE before serving in the British Navy in the latter years of the Second World War, before returning to the LSE again to complete his PhD. He became a leading Marxist sociologist and political thinker. Ralph Miliband occasionally voted Labour, but was also one of its most prominent left-wing critics. Marian, Ed Miliband's mother, shared Ralph's politics and was a lifelong human rights campaigner, an early activist for the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and a strong supporter of pro-Palestinian causes. Ed Miliband joked that while most families played Monopoly, their family played a board game called Class Struggle, in which workers play against capitalists. He met Marc Stears, who would go on to work as Ed Miliband's head speechwriter, at Oxford University.
Yeah, so as Ed always says, we met on our first day at university in the lunch queue, and it suddenly, we were standing next to each other, just waiting for whatever horrible food they were giving us, and we'd started chatting about politics, and that's what he was like. He was incredibly politically excited and engaged. His dad was obviously a famous Marxist sociologist, political thinker, and Ed had grown up thinking about politics. But not sort of narrowly party politics. He did care about Labour Party politics and was engaged in it. But he also thought about all kinds of international political questions and philosophical questions and historical questions. And from day one, you knew he'd be very successful in whatever career he did because he was so clever. But no one expects your best mate at uni to go on to be leader of the Labour Party.
After graduating from Oxford in 1992, Miliband worked for Harriet Harman, who was then Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He then worked for Gordon Brown when he was Shadow Chancellor, and when Labour won in 1997, Miliband became one of Brown's special advisors. He worked closely with Ed Balls, who was also one of Brown's key advisors, and they were known as the two Eds. Miliband stood for election in 2005 and became the MP for Doncaster North, a position he still holds today. Between 2006 and 2008, he held junior ministerial positions before becoming Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in 2009. David Miliband was much closer to Blair than Brown and had become an MP in 2001. I spoke to Eunice Goes for this episode. She is a professor of politics at Richmond American University London and is author of one of the few books assessing Miliband's leadership. Hers is called The Labour Party under Ed Miliband, Trying but Failing to Renew Social Democracy.
You had the typical trajectory of a now modern politician. So he had done his stint as a researcher for an MP, then he was an advisor of Gordon Brown, then he became an MP. 2 posts as junior minister, then he was cabinet secretary.
Many who were more on the left of the Labour Party had hoped that when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair in 2007, he would steer the party away from the more right-leaning elements of the new Labour years. There was a sense that Brown, long seen as more traditional in his Labour values, might mark a return to a more progressive and socially minded agenda. But, as we discussed last week, Brown's time in office was dominated by crisis, most significantly the global financial crisis of 2008. His government was focused on managing the economic fallout, and there was little political space for a radical shift in direction. Instead, many of the core elements of New Labour remained firmly in place.
Some people had faith that Gordon Brown would re-inject energy and creativity and new ideas and radicalism. Whether he would have done, we'll kind of never know, because the crash happened and that characterised the Brown premiership. But I think lots of people, even if they'd been supportive initially of Blair, were looking for exciting new directions, by the 2005-2006 period, and then even more so after the crash.
By the time Labour lost power in 2010 to the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition led by David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and Gordon Brown resigned as Labour leader, a significant portion of the party's base, particularly on the left, felt disillusioned. They believed that Labour had lost touch with its traditional values and working class support. This frustration created the conditions for a leadership contest where ideas about the party's future direction came sharply into focus. It was Will, the editor of this podcast, that spoke to the next guest. Kevin Hickson, prominent Labour Party historian and senior lecturer in British politics at Liverpool University.
The membership had become frustrated with the pace of change. It was a push for a slightly more left-wingly compared to the Blair years, a more distinctively social democratic or democratic socialist kind of agenda.
The Labour leadership election was held in September 2010. David Miliband was kind of expected to win. He had prominence in the country, having just been Brown's foreign secretary, and was seen as articulate, experienced, and closely associated with Tony Blair's legacy. Unexpectedly, Ed Miliband announced his bid for the leadership too, as a candidate on the left, promising a clearer break with New Labour and return to Labour's roots. The other candidates were Ed Balls, Andy Burnham, who had been Health Secretary when Labour lost power, and Diane Abbott. Here's Marc Stears and Kevin Hickson.
Ed, I think, had one really clear ambition, which is why he stood for the leadership, and which is that he wanted the party to recommit itself to, I think, what we might call a kind of social justice or egalitarian agenda. He thought that New Labour had lost sight of the sort of evils of inequality, not just in an economic sense, but in a sort of social and political sense as well.
It became a contest between the two brothers, and David was seen as the continuity candidate and wasn't helped by the fact that a lot of the big beasts of the Blair years came out in support of David Miliband. So Ed became the candidate for change, and ultimately that's why he was able to win the contest.
Ed became leader on the 25th of September 2010, beating David by just over 1%. He immediately stated that a new generation had taken charge of Labour, a phrase that would become central in the first year of his leadership. However, while this victory resonated with many inside the party, it also came at a cost. For the wider public, the image of Ed defeating his brother created an awkward narrative, one that painted him as disloyal or overly political. This brother versus brother storyline dogged Ed Miliband's image for years. It was often repeated in the media, and many voters in some ways never looked past it. Let's hear from Tom Baldwin, Ed Miliband's former head of communications, Eunice Goes, and then James Morris, one of Miliband's pollsters.
And those who knew the Milibands when they were younger say it's probably the most natural thing in the world for them to end up running against each other for Labour leadership. It's a very, very political family. And I never bought this idea of sort of primogenitor, David as the older brother naturally has to become leader. They both ran for the same job, and one of them got it and one of them didn't.
Ed was more empathetic on the campaign trail. He was very relatable and nice. David Miliband on the campaign trail, he was not terribly good with people. He was very good at talking to Hillary Clinton and other leaders, and very articulate in that kind of setting, but less so in terms of relating to the public. Right of the party never forgave him for running against his brother, David Miliband. So David Miliband was the leader that the right of the party would have liked to have, and the fact that he wanted to turn the page on New Labour. And so that was a kind of a very emotional response that then undermined the message.
He didn't win a majority of MPs, and there's a bunch of people, both in the parliamentary party, people who work around the Labour world, who had this sort of sense of entitlement and their kind of career path mapped out around the bookie's favourite candidate winning, and then that was all screwed up by the other guy winning, and they were really bitter and pissed off. And so there was always going to be a challenge about how to manage that.
There was this idea, wrong in my view, that because he was the younger brother, he should not have challenged or stood for the leadership of the Labour Party. And this is wrong because a party is not a dynastic organization. It was an issue that was very often brought up by the media. It portrayed Ed as a ruthless operator, too ambitious, and was ready to sacrifice and betray family and to put power above family. So on a personal level, it did him a lot of harm. It essentially undermined his credibility as a Labour leader.
Looking at this made me personally consider a question about whether a leader who is seen at the outset of their election as leader as being the wrong leader could ever truly succeed. Now, let's look at the team that Ed Miliband had around him. He made Alan Johnson, a prominent figure from the Blair-Brown years, Shadow Chancellor. But only 3 months later, Johnson resigned, citing personal reasons, which forced Ed Miliband to replace Johnson with Ed Balls, who had come third in the leadership election.
He chose Ed Balls for Shadow Chancellor, first of all, because he had been a contender to the leadership of the party at the same time as he was. And Ed Balls was a very powerful figure in the party. Ed Miliband had a very interesting team of advisors, and they were the ones who were engaged in this quite wide, what we call ideational infrastructure. So they had lots of links with think tanks.
Harriet Harman, who had been Brown's deputy leader, remained as deputy leader and shadow deputy prime minister. Yvette Cooper was shadow home secretary and Douglas Alexander was shadow foreign secretary. Let's look at Miliband's advisors.
Created a team which was, I think, largely very friendly, extraordinarily individually talented. I mean, I look back to people that he had. Torsten Bell was running policy, who's obviously is just an enormous policy brain. Tom Baldwin was there as running strategic comms and similarly incredibly smart. Anna Yearley was running sort of the political side of the operation, relationships with backbenchers, and she was brilliant. Later on, Simon Fletcher came on to help with the union work, and Simon is also really inspiring. I mean, these are just amazing people, and they were largely really motivated to work for Ed because they believed in him. So that was really exciting. The flip side of it all is that, he didn't see himself as a manager, so he didn't spend an awful lot of time thinking about how the day-to-day operations of the team, he left that for other people to do.
Miliband was leading Labour in opposition for the first time in 13 years. Tim Bale is Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University and has written widely on the Conservative Party. Let's hear from him on the Conservative view of Miliband.
Well, I think there's no doubt at all, if you talk to them and you read what they've written, that they were absolutely delighted that Ed rather than David had won. I think they regarded David Miliband as a much more difficult prospect. And George Osborne is on record as feeling that Ed Miliband was eminently beatable.
But what did Miliband's team think of their opponents? Here's Tom Baldwin and Marc Stears.
I think they're uniquely cynical and shallow. I mean, I think Cameron, in many ways, has been the most disastrous prime minister since the Second World War, in that he really didn't stand for anything other than just sort of being there. Why do you want to be prime minister? Because I'll be good at it. That was his famous answer. And that complete absence of any values or purpose other than just like it'd be cool to be prime minister because you want to be. It's just it repelled me at the time, and the consequence was not only austerity and huge damage to our economy and public services and people's lives, but Brexit, which is a permanent legacy. At that time, it wasn't even the top 10 priorities for this country. Most voters, it was a priority for Tory party members. And it was Cameron's weakness and shallowness that brought it about.
He was a very sort of effective retail politician in the sense that he seemed comfortable in his own skin. I think people always used to say he was like an essay crisis prime minister, which is that he wouldn't really worry about having not done the prep, because he'd think, I will always pull it together, I'll put on a good show and people will sort of rally round. So, you were dealing with somebody who was very sure of their own abilities. As he said himself, Cameron said himself, I want to be Prime Minister because I think I'll be good at it. That kind of sums him up, really.
Choosing Brown's successor had taken a very long time, from the general election in May to Miliband's election at the end of September. This had given Cameron and Osborne plenty of time to assert their message that Labour had crashed the economy, and they were able to put this message across somewhat unopposed. The Conservatives brought in an emergency budget, which included a £40 billion package of emergency tax increases, welfare cuts and Whitehall spending restraint, marking the beginning of their programme of austerity. Let's hear from Tom Hamilton, former head of research for the Labour Party, who also helped to prepare Miliband for Prime Minister's questions throughout his leadership, and Tom Baldwin.
What Labour was faced with, a lot of that work of definition of the last Labour government, of saying what that term was about from the government's point of view, which was clearing up the mess that Labour had left. It was about Liam Byrne's "there's no money left" letter. It was about that first, as they called it, emergency budget. It was about changing the direction of the country. All of that was done during a time when Ed was not even leader. During the leadership election, when the Labour Party was sort of arguing amongst itself about who the next leader should be.
And the Tories took advantage of Labour having this leadership election to cement in a lie. It was rubbish. The politics of it were used really cynically, I think, to justify austerity, which is partly ideological. Tories don't like big government spending, but partly it was just political. They said this is Labour's fault. It had us caught in the crosshairs, and large parts of the media bought that this was some sort of existential crisis, that we had to cut everything to the bone, otherwise our nation would disappear into a cloud of debt. And it wasn't true.
This left Miliband with a key challenge: how to approach opposing the Conservatives' austerity policies. James Morris explains the complexities of how voters viewed Labour's record.
I remember doing focus groups in Ipswich, and this woman who was a receptionist at a GP's talked about how someone in her surgery, I can't remember if it was like in the care trust or whatever the structure was, but some senior person was regularly taking taxis from Ipswich to Norwich rather than driving or taking the train or any other. And she was like, they're wasting money. Almost everyone in public services who appeared in the swing voter focus groups we did had stories of waste. So there was this sense that Labour was wasteful. When the Tories then come with this incredibly disciplined, clear message that there was overspending, they weren't persuading anyone of anything. They were just pointing out to people things they already thought and telling them, that thing you thought, you were right, and it really matters.
Do you say this is completely wrong and defend the record of last Labour government? Do you accept it as a truth? Including the BBC, most of the media, including the BBC, were agreeing with it, and then say we'll spend differently within the envelope? There are lots of different strategies we could have deployed to do it, and part of the problem was the PLP was quite divided between a sort of more Blairite group, which perhaps wanted to lean in closer into what the government was doing, more left-wing people who wanted to make a fundamental challenge to austerity, and we were trying to pursue a rather sort of narrow ledge between those 2 points.
Miliband and Balls were aligned in their opposition to austerity.
Especially at the beginning of Ed's leadership, they shared their approach to austerity. They essentially believed that austerity was not the solution to reduce the deficit. Their initial response was very much around a Keynesian response. But Ed Balls was then quicker to essentially to accept that they needed to consider and move on.
The reasons why that 2010 period was so hard for Labour actually was purely that they'd been in government so recently. And Cameron and Osborne were very, very good at defining the narrative of that parliament.
But they struggled to counter the message that Labour had overspent in government.
Even in 2015, when we got to the election, there was a question time, one of those like Ask the Leader question times, and one of the audience members said, to Ed, do you accept that Labour overspent when it was in office? And Ed just said, and it's the first time he even said it this boldly that I can remember, no. And the audience started laughing, and it was like, and obviously that didn't make any difference. It's just one moment on telly, but it's emblematic. It's emblematic of the kind of challenge that the voters had there.
It was questionable whether the austerity policies made sense economically. Many argued they held back Britain's economic recovery from the financial crash. But they also had a huge human cost, hitting the poorest in society the hardest. By 2015, the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimated that changes to tax and benefits had cost the average household £1,127. Research published by the British Medical Journal argued that the reduction in spending on health and social care had contributed to 57,550 more deaths than if funding had followed the trends that had been set before 2010. There was an overall slowdown in life expectancy, and food poverty rose sharply. Sure Start centres were closed, and underfunding of public services meant many of the successes of the New Labour years were completely rowed back on.
So it was a disastrous period, politics, and one in which we had got caught out strategically, and the media had sort of decided to agree with George Osborne that austerity was a necessary act. And I don't think we challenged it nearly hard enough.
In the last 4 episodes, we discussed New Labour and the changes that Blair and Brown made to the party from 1994 onwards. Out of power for the first time in 13 years, it was difficult for Miliband to tackle how to move forward, especially with all the big beasts of the New Labour years still very present.
Intellectually, Ed wanted to turn the page. He thought New Labour had got some things right, got some things wrong, but we needed a new project. The polling told him that was what he needed to do. So, all the people who were employed to do opinion polling or focus grouping said, yes, you're absolutely right. People are looking for change or newness from Labour. They don't want, Blair Brown reheated.
When we were polling, should Labour be proud or ashamed of its record? Something like 70-20 people were saying it should be ashamed. If you asked, itemise the record, where do they think it had gone well? They were middling on public services. Actual record on public services was really quite good. But voters were really mixed on whether it had done a decent job on the NHS, on schools and so on. And then they felt like it had screwed up the economy. We just had a great financial crisis. If you're in government and that happens, that's your fault. Right? It doesn't matter what you're responsible for that. Screwed up immigration, and there had been this sort of complete failure to predict the levels of EU immigration, in particular through the accession, and also had screwed up on foreign policy. Wrong. Those are real legitimate problems.
Ed didn't attack Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I did argue with him quite a lot at the time that he needed to do more to defend the legacy of the last Labour government, and it's a strategic choice. He would say, people have just rejected, Labour's like a car manufacturer saying, you didn't like our last cars, so buy a new one. Mm. And I would say, well, don't trash the brand and say, all the cars we ever made were rubbish. We say, actually, that was a great car, but we can improve it.
Miliband chose to quickly denounce aspects of New Labour. This is an excerpt from Gordon Brown's memoir. On the Tuesday after he became leader, Ed Miliband apologised for the mistakes we made in government over Iraq. Although it was not intended as such, this came to be seen as a renunciation of our entire record. The upshot was that no one defended our record. By airbrushing our past and appearing to denigrate our own achievements, we made it difficult for people to feel proud of Labour again. Distancing himself from New Labour in this way was difficult on an interpersonal level. Obviously, Miliband had been part of the New Labour team and had worked closely with Gordon Brown.
Ed had grown up politically with Brown, really admired him, had learnt so much from him. And yet, all of the polling told us that, the feat in 2010 was in part because Brown hadn't managed to sort of reboot the New Labour project in the way that people had hoped that he might be able to, and obviously blamed him in some sense for the crash. And so Ed knew he had to sort of distance himself from Gordon, but wanted to do that in a respectful way, and that was just difficult.
Blair tried to help Miliband behind the scenes.
With Blair, different really. Personally, Blair was really helpful, and Ed saw Blair at the Olympics, and they talked about the speech, whilst watching people run around the track or what have you. And Blair sent in some fantastic comments, and Alistair Campbell also helped on that speech. Some of the best comments or ideas we ever had from speeches came from Blair or Campbell. But obviously there were people who thought of themselves as Blairites who thought that Ed was being disrespectful to their project or what they'd achieved, and who were much more critical and much more difficult. So I always personally found Tony Blair incredibly helpful, but there were clearly people who thought that they were on Tony's side who were much less helpful.
Let's hear from Tom Baldwin on the decision not to celebrate the new Labour legacy.
And I think failing to defend that legacy made it easier in some ways for the Tories to roll back the gains that we had made under the last Labour government. But this was a strategic argument which went on for 4 years, and there's still cases that can be made either way.
Miliband had been elected on a promise of bringing new ideas to Labour to replace the new Labour ideology. He did this. However, he often didn't persist with ideas, meaning messaging could become confused or lack impact and salience with voters. Here's Eunice Goes.
And one of the problems was that because every time he was coming up with an idea, the idea was at the very best only accepted in a most lukewarm fashion. He was always trying out new things. And so in the end, he never had the time to repeat ad nauseum his message.
His speeches could also often be dense, which didn't help with message delivery. Here's Marc Stears reflecting on Miliband's 2011 conference speech.
Its message was perceived to be just much more left-wing than it was. This is the so-called producers speech, when everyone suddenly thought that he was saying all business people are evil, and he hadn't intended to say that at all, but he had sort of misread the politics of how this message would land. But also, it's a very sort of intellectually heavy speech, and there were no applause lines. So literally in conference 2011, I think that was one trickle of applause in the middle of, and then you just like, whoa. And that I think is just inexperience. Suddenly you've got to give a 50-minute long speech, and Ed's instincts were to give quite intellectually heavy speech, which had lots of brilliant content in it, but which didn't sort of excite the room.
Every speech she did to the Labour Party, there was a new set of ideas. And so there was the sense that there was no continuity, and people never had the opportunity to get hold and grasp and fully understand what the idea was about. And that then became a problem.
He has often since said that he believed in pursuing a new kind of politics, and bringing in new ideas was all part of it. We're going to look at all the different ideas he brought in, starting with how he believed Britain should respond to the financial crisis, which obviously differed from the policies of austerity that were being pursued by the Conservatives.
He believed, and it was the belief of other social democratic parties and several scholars, that the global financial crisis of 2008 had created a window of opportunity for transformative change. The global financial crisis was one of those critical juncture moments where transformative change can happen. So the timing was brilliant. It captured the zeitgeist of the moment. There were a lot of discussions about how inequalities not only had risen, but they were the main obstacle to economic growth, to greater prosperity, to higher productivity levels.
I mean, Ed's view was that certainly post-crash, that Britain needed sort of paradigmatic change. Like the economy was broken and it needed to be reshaped, and that doing that was going to be really difficult politically and economically, and you needed to get your head around it ASAP.
And what he tried to do was, we could find similar debates in other social democratic parties in Europe and elsewhere, was to use this moment as a way to bring back social democratic parties to that social democratic golden age, where they were still attached to an idea that in order to bring about an emancipatory project, so a project of emancipating workers and all citizens, you needed to reduce inequalities, you needed, in order to reduce inequalities, you needed to regulate markets, you needed to reform capitalism. And Ed Miliband said, well, let's not waste this crisis. Let's bring back some of the old social democratic ideas, and some of them are about regulating markets, so still operating within a capitalist economy, but regulating markets and empowering workers.
There was often too much policy discussion behind the scenes, meaning strong lines weren't taken at key moments. Here's James Morris.
There was a lot of deliberation around policy, like the policies would ever happen. But they weren't ever going to happen because we were in opposition. There was an opportunity perhaps to be more nimble. I'm not sure whether it's to do with his personal experience, actually, so much as so many of the people that were involved had been in actual policy units making policy decisions in government, and then brought that way of working into opposition.
And the main ingredient that was missing, and that's the main finding of my book, was that Ed Miliband never had the support that he needed in order to carry out his agenda. He did not have the parliamentary party fully behind him. He did not have the media behind him. They did not believe in his agenda. And so without that big support, he vacillated and ended up proposing a manifesto that was a bit wishy-washy, that lacked oomph.
For a period, Miliband followed the ideology of Blue Labour.
And out of that Blue Labour, sort of those debates in 2010, emerged the argument that disconnection from working people was primarily what had gone wrong in those late Blair years, and that required, sort of big economic, social democratic reform.
Blue Labour were formed as a response to New Labour in 2009. It argued that Labour should represent the working class rather than the aspirant middle classes. But, they argued, they referred to the actually existing working class, regarding it as socially conservative and nationalistic. This meant pursuing socially conservative policies while being economically left-wing. Blue Labour's founder, Maurice Glasman, served as a close ally to Miliband during his early years as leader.
Lots and lots of meetings. They've produced lots of pamphlets with lots of very interesting ideas. And I think Ed was interested in that because they had offered a diagnosis of why the global financial crisis had happened. And they also pointed to a path to follow in order to prevent a new crisis from erupting again, and how to address the problems that had been created by the global financial crisis. So it was very influential. The big differences between Blue Labour and New Labour are about the economy. For New Labour, Blue Labour is an anti-business party. It's an anti-aspiration party. And so essentially, the big dividing line is around business. It's about the economy. New Labour saw itself as accepting the neoliberal status quo. We need to essentially to prepare ourselves for globalization. Blue Labour has a very different approach. Essentially, Blue Labour identifies globalization as a problem.
At a certain point, those involved in Blue Labour came to be seen as too critical of immigration and too much on the right on some issues, and Miliband distanced himself from the movement.
The Blue Labour thing then obviously became really conflicted over questions regarding immigration and eventually Europe, when different members of that original group took different views about what reconnecting with working people meant for those questions. And at that stage, the sort of Blue Labour family fractured, and the people who were more conservatively inclined sort of drifted away, although obviously remained in the party.
This brought in a new ideology. In late 2012, Miliband shifted his attention to One Nation Labour. It was clear from the conversations I had that many people who worked with Miliband now see this as having been his strongest iteration.
One Nation Labour was a very interesting idea because, in a sense, he was trying to present the Labour Party as a patriotic project, but it was a patriotism that was entirely consistent with Labour values. It was a message of solidarity. It was a message of common endeavour, that we're all in this together. It was an emancipatory, but above all, a community message.
In his speech, he attacked Cameron and the coalition government for constantly U-turning on policies and attacked austerity measures as being the wrong medicine for the moment. Here's Tom Hamilton, James Morris and Tim Bale.
I think the attack on Tory competence was more fruitful and effective than any of the other attacks that Labour made, and wasn't sustained as much as it probably could have been. There was potentially a lot more mileage in hammering that harder for longer.
He used One Nation. That was in a conference speech which the media loved. It significantly boosted his image with the public, mainly because he was able to say it without reading from notes, which apparently is a skill. Obviously, people have never seen actors before. But it was really transformative in a weird way. But One Nation, if you focus grouped it, voters thought it meant something to do with Scotland and England, and like not Scotland not going independent. They don't know who Disraeli is, and so it didn't mean anything like what it was supposed to mean. Yeah. Right? But the commentariat, who love like political history, hopefully maybe someone listening to this, but it meant loads to them, and so it gave them a little bump with that group, and that filtered through a bit.
The point at which Ed Miliband started talking about One Nation Labour and parking his tanks on Tory lawns in that respect did cause a little bit of concern among some Conservatives. I think some of the measures he was suggesting, for example, price freezes on utilities, were popular and therefore did cause the Conservatives a little bit of concern.
But Miliband didn't stick with One Nation Labour. By January 2013, his focus was for the many, not the few. And in 2014, this focus became the cost of living crisis. Let's hear from Tom Baldwin.
There were a number of different strategies deployed at different times. And that's not a function necessarily of us being unable to make up our mind. It's a function of the fact that this was an incredibly hostile environment and a very difficult election to win, and these strategies weren't sticking. And so when one doesn't work, you tend to pick up another. Should we have stuck with One Nation, for instance, which I think was his best speech in 2012? I think we probably should have done. I think that was our best strategy as well. We then went for a slightly more divisive, sort of many, not the few, strategy, which was hostile to business, hostile to the wealthiest. And I know why we did it, and I know why people in the office argued for it. I always thought Ed's best quality was actually as a rather sort of human, empathetic unifier, rather than as a divisive character. I don't think that's in him. He's a lovely person. And this rather sort of populist, sharp-edged Ed Miliband, I don't think fitted either who he was, and I think it actually alienated quite a lot of people, including important groups like the business community.
All of these changes confuse Labour's image with the public. Let's hear from Marc Stears, Eunice Goes, Kevin Hickson and James Morris on why each iteration didn't stick.
Well, he'd have like 12 people around the table, and you'd basically have a 3-hour like seminar-style discussion. And because he'd established a team with so much talent, those discussions were incredibly, they were brilliant from a sort of academic point of view. But it meant that you were often relitigating or redebating stuff that you thought had been sorted out. You basically spent so long interrogating questions and then re-interrogating questions, then interrogating them again, that you did end up giving speeches which were slightly different than the one that you'd given before, because his mind had changed as he went through those conversations.
The Labour Party is a big tent of a party, so with many factions. So a leader needs to be able to bring unity between the different factions. But in order to do that, he needs to inspire the trust, he needs to inspire the different factions. Now, when Ed Miliband when he was elected leader, I think he very soon realized that, on one hand, he did not have his party fully behind him. And he also soon realized that reforming capitalism in the United Kingdom was extremely difficult, because the British media in particular that represents a lot of very strong pro-capitalist, pro-market interests, was having none of it. And very soon they mounted a very strong opposition to his agenda.
And I think Ed, again, did have a very distinctive thought-through ideological position, which was more traditionally social democratic. I think the tragedy really with Ed Miliband is that he never really seemed to have the courage of his conviction.
The problem actually isn't that each one was crap, it's that there were so many.
As has already been mentioned, a key problem for Miliband was how to approach the media, particularly the Murdoch press, who were squarely against him, often unreceptive to his ideas, and could be very personal in their attacks on him.
His program, though, his agenda was very much reflecting the zeitgeist. This was essentially what organizations like even the IMF, the OECD, the Financial Times op-eds were discussing and suggesting as policy ideas. But the Murdoch press, in particular in the conservative press, they were having none of it.
Very, very hostile environment. Ed never had a honeymoon of any sort. He, from the get-go, even relatively supportive papers were quite hostile to him because he wasn't his brother. And we were always climbing uphill and into the wind.
Ed's idea of freezing energy prices, it was when he made that proposal, it was presented as, Chavez, Venezuela, an attempt to create, a communist regime, completely ridiculous analysis. But then when Theresa May made that proposal, or a similar proposal, it was seen as a kind of rather sensible.
Miliband and his team had diverging views about how to deal with the media, and this led again to an often confused approach. Here's Marc Stears.
Because on the one hand, he had Tom Baldwin, whose view very much was boldness, creativity, strike out, don't allow yourself to be cowed by criticism, fight back if you need to fight back. And then he also had Bob Roberts, similarly senior media advisor, who had come from a tabloid background and whose view very much was, no, you've got to get these people on your side, got to win them round with charm, you've got to sort of shut down critique and attack, stop them mocking you, like be nice to the journalists, whoever they are and wherever they come from in the ideological spectrum. And those two strategies are just very different strategies. And Ed kind of saw the benefits of both. I think he was, chat to Tom and he'd be persuaded by that. He'd chat to Bob and he'd be persuaded by that. And I think you probably see that in the way that the press was managed during the operation.
As James Morris found through polling at the time, Miliband's weak media image meant voters didn't see him as prime ministerial.
If you are not clear on what your views are on the topics that matter the most to the public, or what you would do about it, and if you aren't good at sort of appearing, just looking the part in front of the media, that's not the media's fault. One of the things we did was just show a photo of Matteo Renzi, who just become Prime Minister of Italy. And people were like, yeah, I want a guy like that. They didn't know who he was, but he just is able to look right. And it's not really the media's fault that people form their judgments in the way that they do.
In October 2013, the Daily Mail ran a story about Miliband's father with the banner headline, "The Man Who Hated Britain."
Sometimes he would challenge them, like when they attacked his dad and they said his dad didn't love Britain. And he called it out very aggressively. And similarly with the Leveson inquiry, he was very strong. But at other times, he would, pose reading the Sun newspaper to try and get them on side a bit. And, that was a very different strategy and a very different approach.
We did eventually do this speech in 2014, saying if you want someone who's good at photo opportunities to be Prime Minister and that's your only test, well, we've got one like that. But if you want someone who's serious and has big ideas and in politics for right reasons, here's Ed Miliband. But I think it was too late. And I don't think Ed ever felt particularly comfortable with it. It was one of those many strategies that we tried and then set aside as soon as we'd done it.
James Morris felt that efforts to gain the approval of certain journalists were misguided.
A lot of focus on commentators who could be positive, even though actually hardly anyone reads comment pages. It doesn't make any difference really. but you feel more comfortable. So instead of doing the job really well, building public support, fighting battles where you need to, being bolder, and then being willing to fail, like that's a path that wasn't taken. Instead, it was constantly not getting defenestrated, and that ultimately limped to the end and then was a failure.
Famously, a picture of Ed Miliband eating a bacon sandwich was used to signify his awkwardness and his being out of touch with ordinary people. The Sun used it as their front page the day before the 2015 election, saying, "This is the pig's ear Ed made of a helpless sarnie. In 48 hours he could be doing the same to Britain. Save our bacon." As Miliband is obviously Jewish, the overuse of this picture has also been seen as having anti-Semitic undertones.
And at the end of the day, they put bacon sandwiches on the front cover, and whichever strategy it was didn't work.
As well as the media being against him, Miliband faced division within the parliamentary party, particularly from the Blairites.
That for New Labour, the only way of winning the election is to hold that sort of Blairite position, and any departure from Blairism is electorally self-defeating.
The so-called Blairite wing, but I would say the more right-wing part of the party, did not like the way that they disavowed the legacy of New Labour. That was something that they never forgave Ed for doing it. They were also at the time not ready to understand what had been the mistakes, the shortcomings of the New Labour programme. And they wanted and they believed that the only way to win an election was by repeating the recipe of New Labour. And that's essentially what Ed Miliband did not want to do.
However, he put a lot of energy into maintaining parliamentary unity and did keep the party on board to the extent that other leaders we have looked at struggled to do. But vying for unity also undermined him, contributing to him changing direction too often.
I remember some of his advisors talking about on how there were two Eds. There was the Ed that was full of ideas and transformative zest, and there was the Ed of the political party who knows how politics is done, how the engine works. And they are not necessarily in accordance with each other, because the party, the experienced politician Ed, is essentially telling the transformational Ed that he should not go down that road because things will not happen in a particular way. And so this leads then to compromises and eventually also to some confusion, some ambivalence.
But what did the right of the party want?
Right of the party at the time, they really did not have a solution for the problems that Britain faced at the time. So they were critiquing, but without a solution. And that was a problem for him. So compromise for sure, but also you need to be strong enough to essentially to impose your red lines. And he was not strong enough.
Immigration was a key issue in the country at this time. It had grown in salience during the New Labour years and by 2010 had become one of the most important election issues. Cameron had promised to get net migration down to the tens of thousands. This was damaging, as particularly because Britain had freedom of movement within the EU, meeting this target was completely impossible and made the coalition government look out of control of its own borders. It was a challenging issue for Miliband to approach, as Labour, towards the end of the New Labour governments, had come to be seen as being out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people on this issue.
During his leadership, we had the famous MUGs, migration controls, and he kind of tried to navigate Labour being, as a social democratic party, being an internationalist party that is not necessarily pro-migration, but is not anti-migration. And on the other hand, the concerns that were already being felt, and I think in his constituency probably felt it too, the concerns that the public felt about migration, the feel that there had been a massive increase in the number of migrants.
In 2014, he announced a 5-point plan on immigration. Strengthen border controls, make it a criminal offence to exploit workers, ban recruitment agencies from hiring only migrants, require employers to train an apprentice for each skilled migrant, and make public sector workers learn English. In the 2015 election, the Labour Party famously had a mug available to buy that said "Controls on Immigration, I'm voting Labour." However, studies on the 2015 election have found that, as in many areas, Miliband's message didn't cut through because it was delivered in a manner that lacked confidence. Another big event that we need to consider came in January 2013. Cameron had promised to hold a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU if the Conservative Party won the next election. Miliband opposed this and said Labour would not hold a referendum, meaning had Miliband won in 2015, we would almost certainly still be in the EU today.
Ed finally came to the view that, leaving the European Union would be a ridiculous thing to do, and it was irresponsible for any prime minister to put that choice to the country. Because, why would you ask a country if it wanted to, commit economic suicide? You just don't do that. It's not the responsible thing to do. And then the problem was we knew that was a politically difficult position to hold. And so probably he wasn't as clear or as sort of dramatic in his critique of the referendum proposal as perhaps in retrospect he might have wanted to be.
Importantly, in 2014, Cameron held a referendum in Scotland asking the question, should Scotland be independent from the UK? The no side won by 55% to 45%. It really raised the salience of the issue of independence in Scotland and contributed to the rise of the Scottish National Party as a really dominant political force. Many have said it should have been a lesson to Cameron not to risk future referenda. Let's look at how Miliband and his team prepared for the 2015 election. Here's James Morris and Marc Stears.
I felt like a sudden okay, let's get our stuff together now. And there was a lot more focus on political preparation for an election. So there were debate prep sessions, and we got some really great debate coaches over from the US. There's real sharpening up, and he was way, way better through that process and way more charismatic and effective as a communicator, but it was about 4 years too late.
We spent a lot of money on David Axelrod being a sort of advisor to the campaign 2014, 2015. And as people probably know, Axelrod had advised Barack Obama. And his big insight was soundbite is a mistake. You've got to campaign in paragraphs and not sentences. Mm. And Axelrod was furious at what he saw as the British political culture's obsession with 45-second answers. And so, he would have long conversations with Ed saying, just don't do soundbite politics. First of all, you're not very good at it. And second of all, it's not what the country needs. So Ed was, partially persuaded by that. But then he also had a Labour Party machine around him, which was saying, no, we need our pledge cards and our retail offer and our, clips for the news. And, he kind of saw the pluses of that as well. Mm. So I think we probably went into the 2015 campaign with a bit of both.
Marc said that sometimes the involvement of big former New Labour figures also led to some confusion during the election.
Then it means also that the people that he had to take advice from were those who had been in opposition with Tony Blair in, sort of 1995, 1996, who had quite a different way of thinking about how you win an election. And then we felt that very, very intensely, I think, in the last few months, which was, as you were fighting the election from opposition, you ended up bringing back people who had fought an election from opposition for Blair, who were very talented, but whose worldviews were not Ed's worldview. And that definitely created, I wouldn't say tension, because everybody was working together quite collegially, but they just had different instincts.
By the time that the 2015 manifesto was released, many of those big ideas that had been present during the Miliband years had been watered down.
Plans to ban zero-hour contracts, the living wage, which in the end in the 2015 manifesto were very strongly watered down, so they became kind of proposals, but they were diluted. You had, in one hand, a diagnosis and an ambition, but then the proposals that were made, they were not sufficient to bring about that vision.
The election campaign lacked some cohesion.
Voters did not know very well what the Labour Party was for. Was it anti-austerity or pro-austerity? The fact that the fact that he had forgotten to mention the deficit and immigration in a party speech was when, in the end, the party was committed to such a hard line on public spending. this has always been the dilemma of social democratic parties, so not only of Labour. So the ambition of transforming and bringing about a social democratic vision, and then doing it in an environment that is mostly very hostile to you. And the successful leaders of social democratic parties, they manage to find that sweet spot where they are able to carry out the message and the voters. But these occasions tend to be rare.
As the election approached, polls were suggesting that Labour could be the largest party, if not win an overall majority. Miliband often had a small poll lead over Cameron and the Conservatives. Here's Marc Stears and Tim Bale.
So there was a strong expectation in much of the media that Cameron was in real trouble, that Ed might not win a majority. That would be a big ask. But that Labour would likely be the largest party, probably end up having a different kind of coalitional arrangement after the election, and with Ed as Prime Minister. Ed's team thought, I think most of us thought, yeah, that's probably where we'll end up, but there'll be like obstacles along the way.
To be honest, I think that there was no stage at which they were utterly panicked by Ed Miliband. That's not to say that they thought they would necessarily win the 2015 general election outright. I think many Conservatives, even at the top of the party, thought that it might be another hung parliament, but I think they always were fairly confident that they would emerge as the largest party. Partly because they felt that Ed Miliband, wasn't the best leader of the Labour Party, but partly because, they had plans to, if you like, cannibalise the support of their coalition partner, the Liberal Democrats. And that was a strategy that worked incredibly well for them.
And so I think we went into election day itself thinking it was going to be really tight, but that we would probably be ahead. And the next few months would be a scrap to negotiate a coalition deal or, confidence and supply deal or whatever it might be. The day of the election, Ed said to me, I was in London and he was in Doncaster, and he said, I need you to write like 4 or 5 drafts of speech. A big victory speech if we win by a lot, pretty good victory speech if we win by a little bit, and then various permutations of coalitional speeches. But it didn't occur to either of us to write a defeat speech. Nobody on the team thought we were going to lose in the way that we actually did lose.
The polls closed at 10 p.m. on the 7th of May 2015. Cameron had won an unexpected majority of 10 seats, the Conservative share of the vote increasing by 0.8% to 36.9%. Labour won 29% of the vote, increasing their vote share by 1.5%. The two really significant parts of the result were that the SNP won 56 seats in Scotland, an increase of 40 of which had been Labour seats. Also, the Lib Dems, who obviously had been in coalition with the Tories, lost 49 of their 56.
Lots of us obviously gathered in HQ for the exit poll, and that's when it all fell apart because, that was extraordinary. I mean, all of a sudden you'd gone from... we were really stressed about what coalition negotiations were going to be about. That's what we'd spent the last 2 weeks of the campaign thinking about, like daily meetings about how are we going to deal with what the press would say about Lib Dems or the SNP or Plaid or whatever it might be. And then all of a sudden you were not thinking about that. You'd literally lost the election and it was devastating.
But why didn't Miliband do better in the election? Let's hear from Eunice Goes, Tim Bale and James Morris.
Younger voters and the most progressive supporters of the Labour Party were not particularly enthused, and many of them did not turn out to vote because what was there, for instance, for proposals on housing, on the living wage, on tuition fees and so on. They were not exactly the ideas that those young voters were keen to support.
People didn't see Ed Miliband as a credible Prime Minister, partly because the Conservatives were able to convince people that their so-called long-term economic plan was working and just needed a little more time. The Liberal Democrats' vote had collapsed, and yet many Liberal Democrat voters actually didn't want the Labour Party in power.
Answering those 3 things, can I be trusted with money? the economy more broadly, but money in particular. Am I on the side of hardworking people? Is the new Labour catchphrase, was quite a good one. And do I have a sense that, do I know where they're going? Those are like, if you pass those three tests, you're in a much stronger position. I wouldn't say that Labour passed any of them, and then it's pretty hard to win from that position. It never built trust that it would be able to manage public finances, which are seen as essential to managing the economy. So all of those Tory attacks that Labour's answer to everything is spend, spend, spend were, if anything, more powerful in 2015 than they have been in 2010. And so people couldn't trust Labour with that thing that had been the fundament of Labour's victory in 2005 and essentially 1997.
Tom Hamilton argues that it wasn't really Miliband's fault and that any Labour leader would have struggled to win in 2015.
I am not confident that anyone else would have done either. Although there are lots of contingencies that meant that the precise structure of the 2015 defeat would probably have been different under other leaders. But I think the structural reasons why Labour didn't win the 2015 election are very powerful, and I'm not sure how surmountable they were by anybody.
What was the election night like for the team around Miliband?
I think the Tories had this line, sort of don't give the keys back to the people who crashed the car. And I think basically that won them the election. And there was relatively little probably that we could have done to avoid that. There lots of missteps along the way, lots of things we could have done better. Clarity of messaging, consistency of argument, confidence. But I think overall, my personal view is that we lost the election because, people weren't willing to think about the Labour Party positively again.
Then we went to the pub, and I just remember looking around at the team of people that I worked with who, were just a brilliant group of people. And I'd never before worked in an environment quite like that with just a whole bunch of people who I liked and respected and admired, and we were all working in the service of the same cause to try and secure a Labour government. And we lost. I knew that team would break up and off we'd all go, and Labour may or may not win again in the future, but it wouldn't be with us. And that was a sad moment.
Now let's look in more detail at the impact of Labour's losses in Scotland.
So basically no one saw Scotland collapsing, and then no one saw the Lib Dems collapsing. And as soon as those two things happened, all of the calculations that we had made suddenly looked very different. So those are the two big things. But also I think we had overestimated our own performance in, sort of marginal constituencies.
I think people didn't quite get, and I'm not sure that this was, I'm not sure the Tories did either really, that if you set up if you have a referendum in which one political party is associated with one side of the argument, then even if that argument gets 45% of the vote, which is not enough to win a referendum, 45% in a general election sweeps the board.
Everyone instinctively knew that there was a problem in Scotland coming because we would go to give speeches in Scotland, and whenever Ed would give a speech normally, the party would just send out an email 24 hours in advance and you'd have hundreds of people wanting to come. In Scotland, sometimes you'd get 5 or 6 people, and then you'd be in the bus on the way there, and suddenly, people had to knock on doors to get their elderly relatives
Really?
to sit in the room. And you knew that wasn't about Ed, that was about the Labour Party. The Labour Party just lost its people in Scotland.
Cameron and Miliband had to some extent campaigned together in Scotland, which contributed to Labour's declining vote there.
Removed some of the clear gap between Labour and the Tories, which allowed the SNP to rally around being the alternative to the Westminster establishment, and that referendum also kind of galvanised and consolidated nationalist feeling.
Now, let's look at Miliband's key strengths as leader. Here's Eunice Goes, Tom Baldwin, and Marc Stears.
So his key strengths, I think it was his intellectual curiosity. I think this is something that it's underrated in politics, that intellectual curiosity. He was also a listener, so he listened to a lot of people.
His strength is that he is genuinely empathetic human being. He's really smart. He understands policy. He wants to bring change. He's in politics for the right reasons. He's not in politics for some sort of ego trip.
Extraordinary ability to read the minds of others. I was just completely dumbstruck all the time with his ability to think about different kinds of people and know instinctively about what they would be thinking or feeling or what they would want. He really believes in ideas, and he would always say that ideas drive politics, and he wanted to talk to the people who had the best ideas about the future, be they scientists or economists or community campaigners. He just wanted to surround himself with people who really thought big, and that he could not only understand what they were saying, but he could then synthesize it into new things himself, and that was fantastic to watch.
And what about his weaknesses?
First year of his leadership, he would often begin speeches by saying, being a one-term opposition is really hard, and it needs a special kind of skill. But over time, we sort of forgot that, and I think that's because 2010, 2011 were really difficult years in the polls for him. 2012 and 2013 were much more positive. And he did come, by the second part of his leadership, I think he really came to believe that he was going to win, or had a very good chance of winning. And so perhaps we did take our eye off the ball of the specific challenges of winning after such a short time in opposition. I don't know, he'd probably hate me for saying this, but would probably be kind of ruthlessness, that politics is a kind of nasty game. And obviously he's a very effective politician, but he's not instinctively somebody who likes to set people against each other or play dividing lines or find wedge issues. He's much more comfortable building agreement and consensus than he is sort of building hostility. And that period in British politics was, the time of when Nigel Farage was on the rise, etc. It may have required a little bit more nastiness than is in Ed Miliband.
Miliband resigned as leader on the day of the defeat, and he has since talked about the years that it took him personally to get over. But today, of course, he is prominent in Keir Starmer's government and is sometimes even being talked about as a potential successor to Starmer. The first part of assessing Miliband's legacy concerns a small decision he made to change the way in which Labour leaders were elected. He had abolished the electoral college system and moved to a system of one member, one vote, meaning that the vote of a Labour MP counted the same as a party member. This change meant, in 2015, Jeremy Corbyn was able to be elected leader of the Labour Party, something which never would have happened under the electoral college system. Here's James Morris and Marc Stears.
It was supposed to be an antidote to the idea that he'd in some way won illegitimately because the previous voting system had given unions and MPs and members equal shares of the vote. So yeah, it was supposed to be an antidote to that, but it wasn't because no one could understand what we were talking about. And they didn't care.
The irony on the voting system change is that it was what the right wing of the party wanted. So, the reason that the voting system got changed was because there had been a scandal in Falkirk in Scotland with regard to sort of the accusation was that unions were signing up people to the party who weren't really people, or who didn't really want to join the. There was sort of vote stuffing accusations and pros and cons of it all. I don't really know, but we felt as if there needed to be sort of party reform to stamp out accusations of sort of dodgy dealing, and the recommendations that came from the right of the party was that you want to give members a bigger say in electing the leader. Because they thought that, and they had the data that those people had voted for Tony Blair and they'd voted for David Miliband. So give them more power and they're likely to vote for a kind of right-leaning, centre-leaning candidate next time round. And it turned out that was totally wrong.
Losing it was supposed to be this big, radical, dramatic change, and people saying, "Oh, it's like your Clause 4 moment." And we went and talked to voters about it, and they could not care less. Like, it is totally insignificant. They don't care what Labour's leadership election rules. It's not a fundamental transformation. Went through, it achieved nothing at the time, and then ultimately is the mechanism that propels this idea that Jeremy Corbyn is this sort of grassroots, insurgent, ascendant candidate that his previous left-wing predecessors hadn't been able to get. And ultimately, I don't think he ends up relying on just those votes, but it's the spark that helps him do something that John McDonnell or Diane Abbott or others hadn't.
Now, let's hear from Eunice Goes, Marc Stears, Kevin Hickson, Tom Hamilton and Tom Baldwin on his overall legacy.
For a political party to carry out an ambitious program of change, a party leader needs to inspire the support of those powerful factions within the party, but also of the media, because the media in the United Kingdom has a very, very strong influence in British politics. They pretty much set the agenda. So if they do not believe in the agenda of a particular political party, it's going to be very, very difficult, as Ed Miliband discovered, it's going to be very difficult to carry through with that mission. Maybe he was not the right person. Maybe he is somebody would be a fantastic cabinet minister, but in order to be kind of the future prime minister, you need to carry out a little bit more, I won't say charisma, because I think charisma is overrated, but an ability to carry a big coalition of different groups with you.
I mean, he held the party together a period of time where it could have torn itself apart, almost so well that people didn't notice it. Like, I think that's really important. Like 2015, as soon as he'd lost, Jeremy Corbyn becomes leader of the Labour Party. Like, nobody saw that coming. Apart from perhaps Ed Miliband, in the sense that I think he just knew that those people were there and that the party was, it was going to be really difficult to hold this coalition together. Yeah, look, it's probably true that we spent too long on detail and not enough on campaign. But the explanation was that he really believed that the country was in trouble, and that if you didn't have real answers to the trouble, then you weren't doing your job properly.
A failure because he failed to win the 2015 election because of his own shortcomings, but also more things that he couldn't be held responsible for at that point. And then, of course, that then ushered in a more radical left phase under Jeremy Corbyn. Unfortunately, I was a supporter of Ed Miliband. I voted for him in the 2010 leadership contest and wanted him to succeed, but I suppose ultimately his legacy is one of failure because he'll forever be associated with the 2015 election defeat.
One of the criticisms made of not just Ed, but of the 2010 to 15 Labour project by Jeremy Corbyn and supporters in particular after 2015 was fundamentally to lump them together with the Blair-Brown project. You'll have heard basically anyone who wasn't in part of the Corbyn project being described as a Blairite in ways that really sort of sand off the edges of a lot of different Labour factions which didn't necessarily have a huge amount in common. So the very fact that Corbyn and his supporters were able to put Ed in that sort of Blairite box shows that at least in the eyes of some people within the Labour Party, that project had not succeeded.
But I think that what he did do, which was remarkable, is like inject into high-level political debate a sort of urgency for us to have a new economic, social and political settlement. And, when I look back on those years, we never obviously didn't find a political strategy which was strong enough to win an election against David Cameron. But I am really proud of everything he did to get people talking again about, inequality, exclusion, political dissatisfaction, alienation.
I wouldn't criticise Ed. I think he did an impossible job really well. And, I regard him as a friend now. And I really admire the way he stuck around in politics when lots of others haven't. And I think excellent Secretary for Climate Change.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on Ed Miliband. Today we heard from Marc Stears, Eunice Goes, Kevin Hickson, Tom Baldwin, James Morris, Tim Bale and Tom Hamilton. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy any of their brilliant books, are in the description of this episode. Next week, we'll be looking at Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And leave a rating if you've been enjoying the series. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. The artwork for this episode is by Phoebe Jones. Music is by Rickard Fromm.